assistant professor at Ball State University, Indiana, USA. I also serve as a director of international education and international education research and development for Star Scholars Network. I will be moderating today's webinar that focuses on discussing the issues of COVID-19 and the economics of education. We, Star Scholars Network, have initiated a COVID-19 webinar series. The theme of this series is public health and education in a global transnational society. This is our third webinar of the series. So my colleagues, my colleague, Dr. Retum Goli, the STAR president, would like me to pass on his best regards, greetings to our audience. My colleague, Dr. Christina Bista, STAR Vice President of Education Service, is helping us in technology during this webinar. So the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting many aspects of our life, including education. So given the important impact of economics on education, this webinar focuses particularly on COVID-19 and the economics of education. It's my great pleasure to introduce our three wonderful panelists, Dr. Harry Patrinos, Dr. Najib Shafiq, and Dr. Stuart Satin. Dr. Patrinos is a practice manager for the Europe and the Central Asia region of the World Bank's Education Global Practice. He specialized in many areas of education, especially school-based management, demand-side financing, and public-private partnership. He managed education, lending operations, and analytical work programs in Argentina, Colombia, Mexico, and other countries. He has many publications in the academic policy literature with more than 40 journal articles. Dr. Najib Shafiq is professor of education economics and international affairs at the University of Pittsburgh. From August 2019, he began serving as the executive director of the Comparative International Education Society. He's a comparative education economist. He adopts an interdisciplinary approach and advanced the quantitative method to explore such research topics as the education and social mobility in lower and middle income countries, education reforms, and human capital decisions. So our third guest speaker is Dr. Satin, retired in 2017 after serving for 10 years as clinical professor of administrative and policy studies at the University of Pittsburgh. He's currently an adjunct faculty in the management department of MBA program at the University of Connecticut. Before he actually entered public higher education, he had a 29-year career in the banking industry, serving as a senior vice president and head of international banking at Mellon Financial Corporation, as a president of Bank of Boston International. So in the next 40 minutes, our panelists will discuss the issue of COVID-19 and the economics of education. So Dr. Henry will address the impact of COVID-19 on future productivities. Our second guest speaker, Dr. Shafiq, will discuss how COVID-19 challenges conventional wisdom in economics of education. Then Dr. Satin will talk about the complex relations between COVID-19, the global economy, and higher education. So, Dr. Patrinos, are you ready to start your presentation?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to getting your views and hearing the panelists' their comments. I'll focus today on some recent work on trying to model the impact of COVID-19 on future productivity, taking as the unit of analysis students that are experiencing the closure of schools and reducing their level of human capital. So as we know, at one time in April, I think 90% of schools were reporting closures affecting 1.6 billion children. Some school systems have started to reopen, and in the Northern Hemisphere, we moved into the summer learning vacation. But it's been a huge impact, unprecedented impact in terms of what it's done to health outcomes and health systems, but also on the schooling side has affected many students in all parts of the world. And we know from past research on other pandemics and financial economic crisis that the impact on human capital is long-lasting, and we expect that COVID-19 to also have a profound impact on education and other aspects of welfare. We also, as a preview of what I'll talk about in the next few minutes, most children, but predominantly those from poor households, will suffer a learning loss, and some estimates of about the learning loss of half a year equivalent, maybe more, but certainly impacting the education and future productivity. So in past pandemics, and we don't have many that are comparable to COVID, obviously, but we know that there have been efforts to measure the economic impact. Pandemics reduce output, they reduce our income, they reduce wages, they affect the national economy, and there's been various estimates of this. All of these studies have looked at single-year impacts. The exception is the 1918 influenza, which lasted about 2 years. Many millions of people died because of it, but research, even research that's been published fairly recently, has shown that the impacts lasted a long time. The generations born who were in utero during the influenza suffered major human capital effects long into the 1980s. Pandemics definitely affect economic output, but how they affect labor and wages could differ. The Black Death, 75 million people died back in the 14th century, certainly reduced labor, but resulted in higher agricultural wages because of scarcity. The Spanish flu, the influenza of 1918, over 100 million dead, but definitely lower incomes for all. So severe impact from pandemics, both in terms of numbers of people that have died, but also different impacts on incomes. School closures, there is a small literature on the impact of school closures. We know this from school closures due to strikes, school closures due to weather conditions, but there are other impacts. The Cultural Revolution in China led to the closing of schools for several years. Those children, students who were impacted by the Cultural Revolution suffered a 35% decline in high school completion. We also know and believe that the loss in earnings or future earnings, productivity, due to crises is not distributed equally. Difficult to model that, but we do expect differential impacts. We also know from financial crises, including recent financial crises in Europe, the Great Recession in the United States, that those with more education tend to fare better. They fare better during the crisis in terms of being able to keep their jobs or find other employment, while those with lower levels of education tend to lose their jobs, reducing the overall wages for those with less education. Some estimates of the impacts of crises. Again, these are current year estimates. In the UK, up to 0.4% of GDP lost. In the US, 0.3%. Recent study in Norway on school closures due to COVID suggested that over $200 million in lost future productivity, and another $165 million each day the schools remain closed. So a preview of just how impactful school closures will be on future productivity. So we definitely expect the school closures to reduce learning outcomes. After all, if you're not in school, you're presumably not learning. Since we believe in the value of schooling, we believe that learning takes place in schools. There are mitigation measures, but there will be some level of learning loss. But the question I will address is, how much will future earnings decline as a result of current school closures? Our model includes the fact that we know from global research, thousands of studies, that every year of schooling raises earnings by about 8%. That is, every year of schooling you complete, your earnings will increase by 8% a year for your life. But the school closures will reduce your human capital. So we're estimating about a 4-month closure, which seems to be the end of the spring semester in most countries in the Northern Hemisphere. Of course, different countries have different schooling schedules, but for simplicity, let's use 4 months of school closures. I just heard that in some parts of China, schools will remain closed and they will reach more than 280 days of lost schooling. So we adjust earnings potential by a fraction of the year that will be lost, so about 3% per year less in earnings gain. And we applied this simple model to the United States, the world's largest economy. And we do recognize that there are ongoing mitigation measures, so the schools are closed, but there is distance education programs existing in most countries. Many commentators have suggested it's not really distance education, but emergency remote learning. And this will vary in terms of the coverage, the quality, and of course the access to the distance education methods that are being provided, whether it's online, requires basic things like electricity and gadgets and connections to the internet. So there will be some level of learning loss, which I'll come back to. So what do we find in the United States? What do we estimate potential losses due to school closures? At the individual level, we're estimating a loss of about $1,300 US per year. Over the normal working life of an individual, that's about $33,000. Doesn't sound like very much given the fact that this might be preventing the spread of the virus and reducing deaths. So it seems like a small price to pay at the individual level. But when we aggregate these numbers, and given that in the United States there's 76 million students that are experiencing some level of school closure, this comes out to $2.5 trillion in lifetime earnings losses. So a very large number for the United States, of course, a high income country, so it is a big number. So this is the cost, predicted cost that society as a whole will pay as a result of the school closures. And given that at one time half the country's states decided to keep schools and universities closed until fall at least, and of course, it's an evolving story. Much of this loss may well materialize unless actions are taken now and in the fall to address the learning loss and make up for some of the human capital. But one part of the human capital accumulation that isn't easy to make up for is the lost years or portion of the year of schooling that's lost. So the bank also estimated global impacts, looking at all countries to see what the impact is on learning outcomes. The limitations of our simple study and others is that we know that the quality of schooling varies across countries, and therefore the impact of school closures will vary. There are distributional aspects. Some people have more access to the mitigation measures than others. Some will be affected less or more. And also we expect that the effects of the school closures and the ensuing global downturn in the economy will differ by level of education. So some of the differentiated impacts that I'm referring to have to do with the fact that the returns to schooling may rise during a crisis because of unemployment rates among those with less education. So the fact that there will be layoffs and job losses during the crisis means there will be people that are losing their jobs. The wages at that level of education will decline. So those with higher levels of schooling will experience a relatively higher wage. This is because the job losses among those with less education will create a pool of unemployed, less educated workers. This dampens the wages of less educated, and therefore seems to raise the earnings of those with higher levels of schooling. And this is precisely what we saw during volatile periods in Argentina, for example, where the earnings of educated workers seem to be less affected by the crisis than earnings of less educated. So overall, educated workers may fare better during these crises. So the theory behind this finding is that educational attainment increases people's cognitive skills, and because educated workers therefore would be better able to cope with the crisis, meaning that they'll be able to either retain their jobs because their skills are at a level that employers don't want to lose them, or they're able to negotiate other jobs, being able to seek information from multiple sources about other opportunities, while those with less education, less contacts may be less likely to keep their jobs or to find alternative jobs. So what do we expect will happen to the returns to education during crisis? It depends on what happens to the earnings of those who are educated and those who are less educated. If the changes in earnings are the same, then there could be no change in the return to education. But if they affect those with less education more, then they're likely to increase the returns to education. But what do we find in reality is that as countries experience various economic financial crisis, and Argentina is one case in point, two downturns in the economy, one quite dramatic. But if you look at the solid white line, the returns to education remained at their level or increased slightly. This pattern seems to have repeated itself in Mexico as well during different periods of crisis. Sometimes the returns declined slightly during the recovery period, went up, and then during other crises, the famous 1990s financial crisis in Mexico led to an increase in the returns to education. Similarly, Venezuela, many periods of volatility and economic downturn, but the returns to schooling seem to be quite stable. We look at the effects by level of education, and again, going back to Argentina, the returns at the higher level seem to stay quite constant or slightly increasing, whereas the returns to secondary education fell precipitously during the major crisis in the early 2000s, widening the gap between those with higher and secondary school. So the gap increases, meaning that more education will result in more inequality, which is something that we hadn't seen until the late 20th century, early 21st century. So the crisis is expected to exacerbate earnings inequality because of the difference between the relative earnings of those with higher levels of schooling and those with lower levels of schooling. So to conclude, one of the major recommendations I would make is that given the importance of human capital for reasons, social benefits, but also the economic benefit and the fact that during crises it seems to protect workers, we need to maintain the level of education investment, both private and public, especially public, and to maintain or even increase government expenditures on education. Second, many youth will suffer because of income losses in the household. Perhaps they will have to leave the school system, and especially for graduates coming out during this period of uncertainty, they may need income support, either to stay in school or to help them find jobs, or employment support. Public works programs have worked very well, effectively in many countries during past crises, and they can work again. And also we're seeing that the demand for digital skills in the workforce was already increasing. Commentators have suggested that the demand for such skills will continue to increase during this crisis and beyond. And we're seeing the reliance on technology for schooling, but also for work. So investing in digital skills, technology during this period would make a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So before we introduce our next speaker and then the PowerPoint, I have another quick poll. So I'd like to request our guest to quickly share their responses, which part of the geographically where you are located or attending this session. So I see the polling responses here increasing quickly. So looks like it takes another 30 seconds. I see the 18%, actually it's increasing, 56% from US, 21% from Asia, 8% from Africa, 8% from Europe. So still I need 40 more responses here. I see the 40% responses in. So maybe another 10 seconds. In the meanwhile, Dr. Najib, you can upload your PowerPoint. Okay, all right. I think I should end the polling here and share the result with you. Okay, Dr. Najib, okay. So here is the result. Probably you can see on the screen that we have 54% attending from US or Canada, 19% from different countries in Asia, 6% from Africa, 13% from Europe, 4% from Latin America, and another 4% from other part of the globe. Thank you for attending us this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone. So back to you, Dr. Najib.
Greetings, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially with friends. So the title of my presentation is How COVID-19 Challenges Conventional Wisdom in the Economics of Education. Some context, Harry has already gone through some contextual items. So in some ways, the COVID-19 induced crisis is similar to other recent crises, such as the late 2000s global recession. You have families with less income because of unemployment and underemployment, and you have schools and universities with less funding because of declines in government revenues. But in at least one way, COVID-19 and the COVID-19 induced economic crisis is different, and that is technological disruption. So in education, what we're seeing is a move away from on-site towards online instruction. And in the labor market, we're seeing a move away from on-site to work from home and so on. If this technological disruption lasts for more than a year, it is likely to challenge some of the conventional wisdom in the economics of education. And by conventional wisdom, I simply mean established findings. And so I hope you get the sense that this is an almost entirely speculative presentation. I'm going to cover four areas in the economics of education, four areas of research, see what the conventional wisdom is in those areas, and then suggest how the conventional wisdom may be upended. The four areas that I'll be covering in the 10 minutes that I have is first, the private rate of return to the quantity of education. This is something that Harry Patrinos already sort of went over, but I'm going to provide a little more or something different. The second major topic is the private rate of return to the quality of education. And in both cases, by private, I mean to individuals, not society. That's what private refers to. The third topic is education production functions, and I'll explain what that is. And the fourth topic will be the social rate of return to education. Now, there are several other topics in the economics of education, but I'm just going to go over these four. So let me begin with the returns to the quantity of education. And by returns to the quantity or level of education simply means the returns on investment expressed as a percentage. And this is computed using the earnings of workers with one level of education and comparing the earnings of workers with a different level of education. So traditionally, we compare the rates of return to primary education, where we're comparing those with primary education only to those without primary education. This is really sort of the return on investment of being literate versus lacking literacy. Then you have the rate of return to secondary education, where we compare to private to primary education. And then finally, you have the rate of return to higher education, where we're comparing to secondary education. And so the conventional wisdom in the economics of education is that secondary and higher education rates are comparable overall. Below, I have a table from the latest survey by George Psacharopoulos and Harry Patrinos from 2018. And what they report is worldwide, as you can see, this presents the rates of return by level of education by the per capita income level of a country. But if you look at the very last row there, you see that the rate of return to secondary education is about 15%. The rate of return to higher education is about 16%. Quite comparable. So that's the conventional wisdom, that the secondary and higher education returns are somewhat comparable. As Harry has already suggested, what we're noticing in COVID-19, at least what the preliminary data are telling us, is that university educated workers seem to be doing much better. And it seems like university educated workers have the skills to adapt to the technological change, so the use of Zoom and so on, and also happen to work in occupations that allow them to work remotely. So as a result, what we're seeing are university educated workers being able to maintain their earnings or experiencing relatively minor declines in earnings. And I use the word relative because if you then look at those workers with secondary education or below, what the preliminary data are telling us is that the workers are unable to adapt to this technological shift, either because they don't have the skills or because they work in occupations that do not permit remote work. And so what we're noticing with workers with secondary education and below is they're experiencing rather substantial declines in earnings. And if we notice what is happening in low and middle income countries, what we know is that in many cases, technology education is not provided in schools at the primary and secondary level. Higher education is really the only place that they get an adequate technological education. So, if you happen to be a primary or secondary education graduate in low and middle income countries, you're especially likely to be hard hit from COVID-19. And so what's likely to happen is that the returns to higher education versus secondary education are likely to increase substantially, right? We're going to see, it's no longer the case that higher education returns and secondary returns are comparable. The higher education returns are likely to be much higher. So again, this is a speculative chart or graph based on some back of the envelope computations. But here again, this is from Psacharopoulos and Patrinos. We look at the returns to higher education or university education from the 1970s to 2010. This is the worldwide returns. And what we see is that the worldwide returns, depending on what year you're looking at, is between 10% and about 18%. In all likelihood, what we will see in a COVID world is easily a doubling of that. And that's because higher education workers are able to sort of maintain their incomes or experience minor declines, whereas secondary educated workers are going to experience substantial declines. So that's the first item, challenge to conventional wisdom, is that the returns to higher education are going to be much larger than we've seen before. The second topic that I'd like to cover is the returns to the quality of education. And so there's been research on, whether school quality matters, how much that results in increased incomes in the future. And so the conventional wisdom, for example, in higher education is that the rate of return to higher education, the return on investment, depends on the quality of the university. And recent literature suggests that the returns, the financial benefits from attending an elite university, either in the US or in other countries, is relatively large. And the reasons for these high returns, there are several, but here are some key reasons. Instructional quality. At elite institutions, you get top researchers and teachers. Students learn more, and then with greater knowledge, they're able to go to the labor market and earn more. Then there are also peer effects. There's something about being around highly motivated peers at these elite institutions, which makes students learn more. And again, once they go to the labor market, they earn more. And then there are social networks. So elite institutions tend to have stronger connections with employers, which lead to better internships and placements, and in turn leads to higher pay in the longer run. Now, COVID-19 may disrupt the features that make elite institutions effective, or give them the features that give them their advantage. So first, instructional quality. It's unclear if top researchers will also become top online instructors. Peer effects. It's unclear if virtual meetings are the same as studying together in libraries and dorms. And how COVID-19 will disrupt social networks is still unclear. Will elite institutions still be able to manage their advantage with employers? The third topic is education production functions. And for my colleagues who are unfamiliar with this term, this is just a fancy way of saying how school and family characteristics produce education, or how school and family characteristics affect student outcomes. Again, that's the broad area of research. And the conventional wisdom here is that certain school inputs seem to matter consistently, or at least matter in a lot of cases, whether you're looking at low, middle, or high income countries. So a key one is teacher experience and credentials. Teachers really seem to matter. Another item that, or school characteristic that seems to matter is class size. And class size seems to matter, especially in low and middle income countries. And in richer countries, it seems to matter in lower income areas. And also peers. There's been a lot of research that's been done on peer effects, on having, again, high ability and motivated peers and peers from a higher socioeconomic status can potentially benefit student outcomes. Now, COVID-19, again, raises questions on this conventional wisdom, right? It raises questions on which school inputs matter. So in a COVID world where we have online instruction or hybrid instruction, will teacher experience and credentials matter just as much? Or will other teacher characteristics matter more, such as how tech savvy they are? So in this case, teacher experience, for example, we might see that it's unclear whether that pattern will continue because more recent graduates will be more tech savvy. Will virtual class sizes matter as much as on-site class sizes? Will virtual peers matter as much? It's unclear, right? In terms of what will now matter in terms of affecting student outcomes. The final topic is on the social benefits of education. And around much of the world, governments support education because it leads to social cohesion, which is schooling forces students to consider laws and the greater good. And so the conventional wisdom is that education produces social benefits, such as lower likelihood of committing crimes and a higher likelihood of voting. But a critical part of education producing these benefits is the actual socialization of students and teachers, right? Those interactions. That's the conventional wisdom, that education produces social benefits, but a critical part is the socialization aspect. So in a COVID world, if COVID-19 is reducing socialization with teachers and students, the question is, will education still produce social benefits? It's unclear in my view. So the summary of conventional wisdom that are being challenged by COVID-19, especially for if we consider only the technological disruption aspect of it, and if we assume that COVID-19 goes on for several more months, is that the previous, the conventional wisdom that higher education returns are comparable to secondary education, that's unlikely to hold. We're likely to see higher education returns increase significantly and around the world. Those who have a university education are going to be able to cope with this crisis a lot better. Second, it's unclear if the larger returns from attending elite universities will continue. They may continue, but it's not clear. It's also unclear if the same school characteristics will matter. For decades now, we know that some school characteristics matter, but again, in this sort of online and hybrid world, it's unclear if those same school characteristics will matter. It's likely that we're going to get a new set of school characteristics that are going to really matter. And finally, it's unclear if similar social benefits from education are going to be produced. Students will be spending less time with their fellow peers and teachers, and they're going to be spending a lot more time with their own families and online sources. With that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Najib and Dr. Harry's thoughtful presentation. So I will operate the slide for Dr. Stu. So Dr. Stu, are you ready?
I certainly am. I'll begin in an emotional way. We talked about disruptive influences. I can share that my 2 young grandchildren are somewhere around my house. And if at certain moments, let's say my presentation goes awry and you hear unusual sounds, my 2 disruptors will have entered the room. But welcome to everybody. And I thank you all for allowing me to join this very esteemed panel. My comments really will build on theses developed by Doctors Patrinos and Peak, because I absolutely agree that there is a long-lasting adverse impact on human capital, and that's scary. We can't afford that to happen. And yes, the likelihood of exacerbation of earnings inequality is something that should be of extreme concern to policymakers, and I know we're going to come back to that later on. All of this really places a premium on the effectiveness of education and the resources allocated to education. And I couldn't agree more with Dr. Shafiq that the technology, how we choose to deploy it, and our wisdom, our willingness to invest in, and the skills behind technology will be unquestionably a major part of what our futures will look like for years to come. And I also completely support the sub-segmentation that Dr. Shafiq shared with you, that the impact of the pandemic or any type of socioeconomic and funding crisis is not shared equally throughout all of higher education. We do have to bear in mind that we have different ways in which top-tier research institutions may be adversely influenced, public four-year universities, elite private colleges and universities less so, and then of course very vulnerable community colleges. So the gravity of the problem is significant and difficult to quantify at this point. Yes, we can make assessments, but much of our assessments in today's world will be a function of things that are beyond the scope of education, in that how will we and when will we and to what extent will we develop the ways of combating the pandemic, of developing inoculations to prevent it, and practices in our economy and our social behavior and healthcare practices in such ways that we can minimize, to the extent possible, the effects of the pandemic. But this is a deep hole. This is a scary situation. There's no question about it. And as I'll share with you later on, in higher education, certainly in the US and in certain other countries, was already increasingly in a fragile mode. And I'll share more data with you on why I believe that was the case. Finally, I think this will test our capacities for creative thinking, our abilities to adapt at the personal and institutional levels, and that we are not going to have complex problems solved immediately, painlessly, or through quick fixes. So muddling by with budget, line item budget management is simply a palliative and will be, I believe, proven ineffectual. Now, from a pre-pandemic standpoint, there were forces beyond the control of higher education. We have to understand that. Geopolitical tensions, rising and emergent nationalism and border conflicts, and the way in which belief systems behind or supporting globalization and regionalization were suffering credibility gaps. And that works its way directly into our internationalization of our student population and other ways in which we would like to be able to comport ourselves. On the other hand, the connectivity that we have in communications, technologies, capital markets, commerce, supply chain management, mass migrations of displaced peoples, our shared concerns for health, environment, and resources, these were developed over decades. And I don't believe that, well, they may be stymied and challenged in the short term. I don't see a reversal of these trends to come, and I think we have to bear that in mind. So in that sense, I would look upon the pandemic as, yes, a disruptor, but not a complete destroyer, not unless our leadership proves woefully ineffectual. And the jury's out on that one. Now, from a pre-pandemic standpoint, we had other types of more subtle challenges, more nuanced challenges in education. When we began to shift some years ago from news media and news outlets as sources of news, interpretation of news, to postings and, let's say, word of mouth, we began to see a form of disturbing socialization of the communication process and ideologies trumping realities. Fantasy overstating, let's say, a reality check, if you will. And this really places an extraordinary premium on higher education that goes beyond development of conventional needs for critical thinking and research, but how are we developing our students? Can we develop them? Will we commit ourselves to developing a student population capable of independent thinking? And a population that cares for persons other than themselves. Social values absolutely will matter in this sense. I think in higher education, we've been challenged by some time by the fact that we watch young people who are visual learners. They are incredibly adapted to the technologies. And in some cases, we still have a lot of faculty members who build their instructional processes over the conventional lecture, which in my estimation, more cases than not, is a woeful turnoff to students. We have to learn how to develop modalities. And I wouldn't say as a calculated benefit of a pandemic, but certainly, and I would echo the words of my good friend and colleague Sheffi, Dr. Sheffi, that this move to online learning and unconventional sources of learning in higher education could turn out to be quite a game changer and could turn out to be highly beneficial if we really put our minds to understanding the learning process through the lens of our students and treat our students as a consumer population that is value driven and really will grow in some reasonable proportion to the extent to which we're able to reach them, turn their thinking processes on, help them develop the social skills and workplace skills that will lead to their success. Now, quantitatively, if we could just go back for a moment, well, on the prior slide, the one point I wanted to mention is that in the United States, at least in many of my comments are US-centric, but have implications elsewhere, we had already seen for many years a disturbing trend of a large population of students, well over 70% of the students, who are graduating from high school and taking our college placement examinations and were proving to be not college ready in basic disciplines, one or more of them, be it reading, be it writing, be it science, be it math. And that means that students who proceed to college and they're not college ready, they need way more resources than the self-starter who's good to go from the moment they open the door in a college environment. Enrollments have declined materially. And the data is kind of scary because this really means that as we've seen that we have to invest in capital, we certainly have been losing more people from the grid, that the students who are going to college aren't college ready from the get-go. The attrition rates, for reasons that in some cases are financial, but in other cases have a direct bearing on educational preparation, aren't there, and they're falling off the grid. And therefore, we're suffering a very substantial degenerative effect on our human capital. Public funding from the state level has been receding for years in the United States. It's kind of interesting and sad, but more and more states and operating funds for public colleges and universities and community colleges have come from the state level, whereas normally the research grants, financial aid, and other forms of resource allocation that are not directly related to tuition subsidy have come from the federal government, and that over a period of years has been growing somewhat. But the pressures, notwithstanding the pandemic, were already mounting substantially. The state budgets were being consumed, and I don't say this in a pejorative way, necessarily by the rising costs of elementary and secondary education, rising costs of Medicaid, and in many, many states in the United States, a woeful underfunding of retirement plans for public employees, all of which meant that this was going to be a perpetual scramble for public universities to get tuition subsidy assistance from at the state and local government level. Now, students, those who are in college, we take a look at the extraordinarily and the frighteningly high level of accumulative debt. Those who do graduate, in some cases, by the way, there are many colleges and universities where the graduation rates is sadly low. But that means that students who fail to get the degree have accumulated debt and still haven't worked their way into the skill level that affords them a higher level of compensation. And even for those who do graduate, and if they're attending, and if they've built up a very large personal debt level through the undergraduate process and graduate school process, they too worry about affordable tuition. Higher education expenses, the data tells us, it informs us that the cost of higher education has gone up well over the consumer price index, well over inflation for many, many years, even more so than the cost of healthcare. Now, if we take a look at another ingredient that's challenging higher education, certainly in the United States, it's the ways in which xenophobia have rolled into restrictive practices and how many students we will allow, and in some cases even faculty members, to come into the United States. And this really means that whenever and wherever xenophobia is manifest, we're paying a price in foreign capital with whom we not only look toward for, let's say, taking an important role in our classrooms as students, but also our faculty, our administrators. We operate in a global environment and yet we're restricting our capacity for that personal interaction that's so imperative to really globalize and embrace others. Financial stability and business models of higher education have been challenged for years, and make matters worse, at too many institutions we face institutional cultures that are substantially change resistant. It's kind of like saying, yeah, we know things are changing out there, but we're kind of above it. We don't really need to worry about it. Well, actually, we do need to worry about it. Now, continuing from there, if we think about it, I believe COVID-19 is not the principal cause of these types of problems that we're facing right now, but it certainly is an extraordinary accelerant. It's at this point in time, absolutely no credible person inside or outside of education can argue a plausible case that change is not needed. So COVID, by accelerating the process perversely, is bringing to our attention some very serious systemic issues that whether it's income inequality, educational inequality, political tensions, you name it, because this is a period of time that calls upon us to reflect on how we got to where we are, and then what are we going to do about it? I would jump down only to the final point of institutions really are so reliant on leadership and those willing to take a hard look at realities, be the external trends that challenge us or create opportunities for us. And I would certainly support the thesis presented by Dr. Shafiq that technology is to be embraced anywhere and everywhere possible because it affords us opportunities to leverage human capital in ways that could not be done in a very labor-intensive kind of way. Yeah, there's a lot of what's happening right now as a consequence of the pandemic that is difficult to quantify or predict. But yes, by the same token, if we look at the data developed by Dr. Patrinos, we really can understand that there's a lot that we can learn from the past and put up on the screen some of the possible predictive realities. But how deep will the hole be when it comes to unemployment, underemployment is really, I think, far less predictable. And we also are in a period where we're going to be resource deprived. There's no question about the fact that we saw debt levels frighteningly high, not only at the individual level, at the home, but also a number of companies, a number of financial institutions heavily leveraged these days. Too many states highly leveraged, federal government in the United States running frighteningly high levels a budget deficit before the pandemic, all right? So now the question will be, what do we allocate and what will be the formula that brings us forward as opposed to listing backwards and proving ourselves less capable of returning? So the question will be, are we at a point where we will have this is a passing moment. We'll get back on our feet. We will do what's right and what's smart remains to be seen. So really what we face is during a period of reflection, how do we redefine our personal missions, our institutional missions and visions, our core values? And when are we going to stop to just put aside only the concern for how we manage a line item budget from one year to the next, because that will not change our ways. That's a failure. It only manages to control certain expenses. It's not a strategic tool. Yes, we have a lot of questions about what will the public sources of funds and policymakers do? How will they envision and re-envision, if at all, higher education, primary and secondary school education? Are we prepared to reallocate funds in a decisive way in the direction of building up our critical human resources? Or are we going to look upon education as nothing more than an expense that competes with all sorts of other calls on capital as an expense? And if we do the latter, we will pay, in my estimation, a very heavy price for many, many years to come. If we can manage to convince policymakers that education is in fact a way out, a path forward, and to prove it through proof statements. And we have a lot of that data right now, as Drs. Shafiq and Patrinos have indicated. We know that persons with higher degrees and higher skills are more resistant and more, to economic, adverse economic impacts, but more importantly, they are the rock bed that we build our future on. And that's really where I would leave us. We must develop leaders in the public and the private and the educational sector who are agents of change, who welcome innovation and critical thinking, and stop pretending that we are somehow decoupled from the world around us. We have the capacity to rebuild our model for years to come, but dare we not fail. There are lessons out there, and I simply put a few up there for your consideration. It's not as if we're dealing with a blank piece of paper. We know that there are extraordinary models of collaboration between public school districts and community colleges, public universities. We know that Purdue University by hook or crook managed to maintain zero tuition increases during the past 5 years, and the list goes on. We've seen extraordinary successes at Georgia Tech, Southern New Hampshire University, and other institutions that have invested significantly in online instruction. And we've also really come to understand that there is really a residual benefit to evidence-based planning and transparent management processes, and done in ways where we are embracing internal and external audiences so that we really rally around our community needs and our student needs. And I would leave us with the idea that higher education, absolutely at this institutional level, must consider the importance and value the importance of developing an enduring and inspirational brand that reflects reality. Because when students vote with their feet, and that takes place when we see steady declines of enrollment at a lot of institutions, that's not just, in my estimation, a reflection on their financial realities. It's a reflection of their level of confidence, or increasingly questioning of that level of confidence in the institutions they attended. And with that, I thank you all.
Thank you so much for Dr. Stu and Dr. Najib, Dr. Henry's insightful presentation. You not only provide us substantial data on how the current COVID-19 impact many aspects of education, especially economic, financial aspect of education, but also, raise some thought-provoking questions and give some recommendations. So I appreciate that. Dr. Vista, would you like take a couple of seconds to do the poll?
Sure, absolutely. Here is the question on the screen. You see, we are asking you if you are interested in some of the journals or the book project or webinar that we do have on behalf of the STAR and our partnering organizations. Right now, we have 10 professional journals that we have housed under STAR umbrella, and also we do the book project with different publishing houses. And the webinar has been conducting since 2015, and probably we have done over 50 webinars. So please let us know. I see the responses are increasing here. I will take another 10 seconds. Okay. Yes. All right. Okay. Okay. Still the poll are in. I get the 70% responses in. Right, so I will end the poll here and share the results with you. Probably you can see my screen. We have 63% participant guests are interested in the journals, and you can see them on the screen. Then 29% interested in the book projects, and 79% in the webinar series, and 61 in the conferences and symposium. These are the conferences that we cross-list from CIES or AERA, or some of the other renowned conferences that we cross-list on our website and support our new colleagues. Then also we have 32% receiving our newsletters and 21% interested in partner or affiliated activities. Thank you so much. Back to you, Sunil.
Thank you, Dr. Bista. So in the next 10 minutes for our panel discussion, we would like to have our guest speakers to share their thoughts about some important questions, such as this one, okay? Now, from the perspective of economics of education, how do panelists understand, the implications, of the differentiated effects of that COVID-19 has on high and low-income countries and on different group of children and young people within countries? I know all our guest speakers has touched on, or provide some substantial evidence on this topic. So perhaps maybe you can, reiterate and share your further, thinking about these questions. So Dr. Najib, Henry, and Dr. Stu, go ahead.
Maybe a couple of comments. One is that in terms of the work that I did looking at earnings potential losses, in absolute terms, the earnings losses will be greater in higher income countries because they're higher income countries. So there's more to lose. But in terms of a share of resources, I think lower income countries will suffer the most, because any income decline will definitely push people into poverty. We already have estimates of growing poverty levels because of the current crisis, but if you add to that the potential losses in human capital, then these are pretty much devastating losses. And we're seeing for the first time in low-income countries that we're going to have recessions. I think this is the first time since 1870 that the world will be in a recession, with most economies showing downturns. So definitely the impact will be greater in lower-income countries. Shooting, you might be muted.
Yes.
So Dr. Najib, would you like to talk a little bit on that? It seems like Dr. Najib's screen is frozen.
Yes, and I saw the Dr. Sutin saying something. Dr.
Okay,
Yeah,
sure, go ahead.
um, I would reinforce the comments of Dr. Patrinos from my international banking experience and having lived in several countries that were, let's say, with limited resources, financial and otherwise, and have traveled to many, many of these countries over the years. Really, gravity of resources for education, public health, and many, many public housing as well, which was really pronounceable and further exacerbated, if you will, the enormous haves and the have-nots. And the sad part about it all is that my experience is I saw young people with a great appetite to learn, to grow, to accomplish. So the situation is much more apt in the short term to get worse rather than better in those countries. But I would also say that in the countries, precisely for the reasons of the data that was shared by my colleague panel, the working class population, those who are already at risk substantially, are equally going to be suffering. Sadly, it's in some doubt as to whether or not we will be getting resources beyond simply subsidies to help people not buy, but to build the rock bed and really invest in human capital the way we must if we're going to have a future that's better than our past.
Mm-hmm. So, Dr. Najib, do you have any comments on this question?
His microphone is not working. Maybe we can move on to the next question.
Okay, sure. So, next question is, by hearing from, listen to, all of you's presentation, I get the impression that, as your presentation have clearly, collectively points out, we are actually in the conjunctive crisis consisting of not only economic crisis, but also political crisis, educational crisis, historically and currently, especially induced and worsened by current COVID-19 pandemics. And to think about conjunctural crisis, different social force, the historical educational problem, and existing and current contradictions come together in the time of COVID-19. So such a conjunctive crisis is actually made of accumulation of social contradictions and breaks. It seems to me, we are, this crisis is like unresolved ruptures of current epoch. And however, as many critical scholars have reminded us, crises are moments of potential change. So this makes the questions as showed on the slide is very important. How can policy make how can policymakers do now to mitigate the negative effects of the current crisis? So what do you panelists think about this question?
Well, if you like, I begin. In some cases, there no doubt will be a gap between what policymakers can do and what they do. But I think, in a sense, the bad news, if you will, is that we've seen policymakers, even in reasonably affluent economies, underinvesting in human capital in ways that are very, very disturbing. Will that change? The jury's out. I do think, to some degree, the burden of proof rests with higher education to prove its value proposition and to really make the case strenuously to politicians and those to the public who put policymakers in office, those who are elected officials, that human capital is not simply an option, it's an imperative to invest in. Now, in terms of the short term, we've seen some, I think, reasonably intelligent short-term funding measure in the United States and some other countries where we have more to draw upon that infuse very substantial levels of capital into the breach caused by the pandemic. And it's taken a variety of forms of subsidies. Also, the Federal Reserve Bank, clearly having learned the lessons from the Great Depression in the 1930s, it's using capital to maintain the stability of financial markets, the financial institutions, and corporate debt, if you will. But that's really trying to keep our noses above the water while the turbulence remains. And so the question really beyond short-term stabilization, if we're in fact able to sustain ourselves, is whether we are prepared to allocate our limited resources to a direct investment in human capital and really reprioritize our spending, because there is substantial concern that, at least in the United States, less so in certain other countries, that special interest groups have large sway, enormous influence over budgetary decisions and over priority setting and setting of strategic directions. So the true policymakers have the tools at the national government level, the state level. How effectively will they deploy them is an open question.
Thank you, Dr. Stu. How about Dr. Najib and Harry?
Harry, go on. I lost sound for a second.
Okay, thank you. So I agree with Professor Sutton on the approach that's needed. I think what we can advocate for is those of us educators and interested in promoting the idea of investing in education is to focus on the learning loss, because I think that's addressable to a large extent, and we need to start now. So I've been looking at some of the short-term and medium-term policies of countries as they respond to the crisis in terms of the learning loss, and I see a few things that I think are useful. One is to think of education as a core sector industry that needs to be supported. Just like the financial sector, I think the stimulus needs to go to education. I also think that this loss in education because of the school closures needs to be addressed right now with an increase in spending in order to catch up to the loss. There's not much we can do going back. We can't go back in time, but we can definitely try to address whatever learning loss occurred. I also think at some point students will return to the classroom, and because they will have had very different experiences with the school closures and the summer learning loss, we're going to have a much wider or more dispersed learning gaps coming to classrooms, and teachers won't know which students are furthest behind. So we need assessments, rapid assessments of learning loss in the first few months of schooling, so that teachers can address their strategies. And this would also require, with the increased funding that's needed, to provide tutoring programs called high dosage tutoring that's proven effective in the U.S., especially in the high performing charter schools, and to use, once physical distancing requirements are relaxed, to bring tutors into the summer learning programs, summer schools, and perhaps even extend the school year. Some countries, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Hong Kong is extending the school year or opening earlier. So to give more opportunities once the physical distancing is relaxed, to bring in the extra support for those students who fell behind. I also think the crisis has exposed the weakness in education systems. That's the distance learning systems that are not prepared for massive school closures and addressing diverse learning needs. So we need a better distance education system in pretty much all countries, and something that's sustainable and resilient and is integrated into the school system, because we were caught off guard with the school closures. People weren't ready. But I think good online learning is not the same as what you would do in a classroom setting. And then finally, because people will drop out or be forced to drop out, we need a lifelong learning system, something that recognizes people's credentials and allows them to come back, to re-enter the system, to get the qualifications they need, and especially the human capital that they would have lost during the closures and any further absence from school. But the time to start that is now. I think summer break has traditionally been a time of learning loss, especially for disadvantaged students. I think it's going to affect a lot more this year, and the sooner we do these things, the better. And I think education is a huge part of the economy. Any extra spending on education also stimulates the economy and provides the ability to come out of the recession sooner. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Henry.
I would just add that support for families is critical at this point. It's a part of, you can consider it a part of education, right? So students are not going to school, they're not getting nutrition. In a lot of cases, we're talking about the most disadvantaged populations. So, I think an argument that can be made for providing financial support for families, whether it's the monthly checks or, the equivalent in other parts, it's not just, income for, for job loss or reduced hours. It's also critical to providing support for children, whether it's health care, whether it's nutrition, or whether it's educational support.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dr. Najib, your thoughtful comments, and that makes us think about how we can do better jobs in promoting educational equity and equalities in both national and global context. With that said, we would like to move into Q&A portions. We already see some audience type out the questions. So Dr. Bista, could you please select 2 questions?
Sure. Yes, definitely. And I appreciate our distinguished panelists already answering many of the questions, and then we received several questions. So I will take this question from Crystal. Crystal is asking that, there are lots of changes regarding the standardized assessment like ACT, SAT. Schools are dropping this. So currently we are witnessing the historical decision of American universities in the United States, in different states and universities, which have dropped this requisite related to SAT or ACT admission scores. What are your thoughts on the potential of these decisions to increase access to higher education for a broader range of student groups, including minorities and Asian and other groups?
That's for us to respond to, Dr. Vista?
Sure. Yes, this one, Dr. Sutin, but any one of you can do. And also I request the panelists just to, type the answer to some of the questions so that we can, consider the time also. Thank you.
I mean, I would offer one observation that I think there was already a lot of evidence on the potential bias of existing selection exams, and I think very good decisions were made early in the crisis to postpone or cancel exams because it would have further disadvantaged particular groups. And now we're seeing that systems can function without some of these tests. So I do think it's time for a rethink of the selection mechanisms that we have and how we can use this crisis to put in place a system that's fair to those historically underrepresented groups in selective school systems. I think this debate happened very quickly in the US and some other countries. I think other countries rely on these selection exams throughout the school system, and they have been more likely to postpone but not cancel these examinations. And I do think with school closures, it will disadvantage those that would not have done as well on these tests, and it presents a further disadvantage. So I'm all in favor of rethinking the selection to infuse this with some evidence. I mean, like it or not, we do have a natural experiment now to see what this means in terms of access to selective schools and whether the exams are useful or not. I imagine they are useful to a certain extent, but there is an identifiable proportion of the population that doesn't do as well and might be missing opportunities. Thank you.
I would like to build on your comments, Harry, in the following way. If we look at data just in the United States of over the past at least 5 years, which I did just recently, we have hardly moved the needle as a country in terms of college readiness of high school graduates, in spite of all the accenting and dedication to what I would call, and others have called, teaching by the test, teaching for test-taking purposes. It's been a failure. We're not engaging our students. We're not helping them learn. We're not helping them develop intellectually. We're not making education an exciting process. They are turned off by rote-based learning. They don't want to be mechanics, and yet we steadfastly take a hole that we've dug for ourselves as a country, and we keep digging, and that hole keeps getting deeper. So yes, for a whole bunch of other reasons, we have to take a look at evidence as to what works and what doesn't work, and find ways of engaging our younger population and our at-risk populations in ways that really make education an exciting process. And we've seen some models that are working superbly. The problem that we have in a lot of ways is that we are so discombobulated, and our whole delivery system from pre-kindergarten through higher education, that when there are models that are shown to work exceedingly well, as a system, we are not building them to scale. So it's really quite a free-for-all. It's a Donnybrook. We throw begrudgingly inadequate financial resources into the pot, and we somehow expect that we'll get a better result without changing our delivery models.
Thank you. I will take one more question. This is also back to Dr. Stuart. Can you identify one strategy that universities can implement to restore public faith in universities' commitment to evidence-based planning and decision-making, not ideology? And the follow-up is here, moving forward, how universities can do to convince the public of the utility of investing in higher education?
Well, I think as an example, there are many examples, by the way, of research universities that are doing phenomenal work. We can go right across the strata, community colleges that have extraordinary records of success. But if I were to lift out one example and say, let's learn more from it, I would take the work that Paul LeBlanc has done as the president of Southern New Hampshire University, a school of 3,000 on-campus residents, and still a school, a university of some 3,000 in residence campuses, but currently servicing an online student population of 120,000 students. Their delivery model is not just limited to online learning as a delivery system, but I've been to their site in Manchester, New Hampshire. I've seen the extraordinary investments that they've made in educational software, and very eager younger age people who monitor minutely the progression of students who are enrolled in their courses. They don't wait till a student has a failing grade. When they see that during the course of a semester, assignments are lagging, grades are suggestive of a need to change, they have aggressive intervention strategies right on the spot. And by the way, they deliver their degree program for a fraction of the cost of a degree program at a conventional residence college and university. So there's a reason that their growth is exponential. It's not simply advertising. They deliver results. What I'm simply saying in a microcosm is that there are ways to combine intelligent human support with very effective technologies and software to produce extraordinary results. Our task is really to find out what's working well and to build on these proven models.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stu, the response. So Dr. Najib, do you have any comments and response?
I'm sorry, the question was what universities can do to restore faith. I think one point that we mentioned, if the question was, are universities worth it? I think in this day and age, because of the COVID crisis, we will see that those with university degrees will do a lot better. Now, the other part, of course, is the cost aspect, and costs remain high, and precisely at a time where university is going to be less affordable to even to growing numbers of people. How we tackle that is really is beyond is unclear. But I am seeing, for example, in universities where people are really thinking about how to offer cheaper degrees, often in a hybrid format.
Mm-hmm. So today's discussion, I feel like I'm very impressed by the panelists' insightful presentation and comments and response. Especially our discussion touched on a wide variety of educational issues, not only from the perspective of economic of education. We also touched on social benefit of actual interactions of teachers between teachers and students. Also, how we can think about to effectively support families, especially those disadvantaged families, and also from these topics to how we can think about the potential impact and change on college access, so on and so forth. So on behalf of STAR Scholars Network, I would like to thank you again for Doctors Patrinos, Shafiq, and Sertin, for your time and insights. You are very much appreciated your hard work. So I also want to thank you all audience for joining us today, sharing your questions and ideas with us. We will continue such a sort of conversation as STAR Scholars Network will offer another webinar regarding changes in higher education in the time of COVID-19 and impact on teaching, specific teaching issue and research next month on July 13. So for more information on STAR webinar series in higher education, you can find it from STAR Scholars Network. So in addition, for okay, here is the upcoming webinars, information, registration directions, and a webinar series in higher education in each month. And also for those audience who would like to receive a certificate for your attendance of today's webinars, please directly contact Mr. Bye Kamoro. His email address is listed on this slide. So if you have further questions about today's webinar discussion topics, please contact us. These are the contact information or guest speakers on the Stop COVID-19 webinar planning team. So I wish you all best. Stay safe and stay healthy, everyone.